Joining me now is Rob Lee. He's a former Marine Corps infantry officer and an expert on Russian defense policy. He's currently a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Mr. Lee, thank you for joining us. It's good to see you this evening. I want to ask you about a senior Pentagon official telling reporters today that the Russian military's lost more than 10% of its combat power that was sent into Ukraine. There's no indication that reinforcements are being brought in from Russia, though we do know that they've been trying to recruit people into the military. Talk to me about this idea of losing 10% of your fighting force. In military terms, that's actually a turning point.
Yeah, I mean, it's significant because, Russia clearly has not achieved its goals yet. It clearly wants to seize cities. It wants to encircle Kyiv, probably Odessa, some other areas. It clearly wants to further degrade the Ukrainian military. And at every step of the way, Russia's facing significant attrition. And the more attrition they face, the more limitations they have on what kind of offensive operations can they do, and can they actually take big cities like Kyiv, which would require additional casualties. And so, the figures we're seeing are, and this is being backed up by just open source information on number of destroyed or captured vehicles. All that's indicating that the Russian military is going to really struggle to conduct, further offensive operations for weeks and weeks at a time. And really, they're facing kind of a number of limitations at this point.
The Kremlin doesn't report on how many Russian troops have died. They do give out numbers, but they tend to be very low. We get much higher numbers from the Ukrainian government. We had a fairly sort of middle-of-the-road estimate by U.S. intelligence. But yesterday, a pro-Kremlin news outlet briefly reported that nearly 10,000 Russian soldiers had been killed, and then suddenly that reference was quickly removed from the website. What do we make of that? These numbers sound really remarkable for a major, long-standing army like the Russian army.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. It could be just a hack, or it could be an intelligence operation from the Ukrainians, who obviously know what they're doing in terms of intelligence. Or it could have been just a mistake, and it was, actual factual information was published that wasn't supposed to be published. Hard to tell, but, clearly we know the Russian military is taking heavy casualties, right? We can see this from destroyed vehicles, from destroyed convoys, that they're clearly sustaining really heavy casualties. And it's significant because it's not like anything Russia's faced in the last, few wars they've fought, right? In Georgia, they had fewer than 100 casualties or fewer than 100 deaths. In 2014, 2015 Ukraine, it was only in the hundreds. In Syria, it was the low hundreds. So what they faced after a week in Ukraine this time was greater than the last three wars combined. And then, that was weeks ago, and now the figures are obviously much greater. So even if that figure, I don't know the veracity of it, but it's probably somewhere in the ballpark of what the actual casualty figures are. And when we talk about that, right, that's a substantial share of the Russian invasion force. And so again, that kind of attrition, it really affects what the Russian military can do at this point, because it limits their kind of the goals they can achieve.
Let me ask you about air support and Air Force. The Ukrainians do have an Air Force. They do have trained pilots. The New York Times has some interesting reporting about the Ukrainian Air Force and how it's operating in, quote, what the Times says, near total secrecy. One of the pilots they spoke to said, quote, in every fight with Russian jets, there's no equality. They always have 5 times more planes. And despite being outnumbered, Ukrainian pilots have been successful at preventing wider bombings. They've intercepted some missiles. Talk to me about this. They are vastly outnumbered by Russian jets. How is it? What's the outlook for the Air Force in Ukraine?
So that's one thing. It's not fully known. It's kind of hard to tell from just open sources exactly what they're doing, and partially because I think they want it that way. But clearly they're still operating, and clearly they're making life difficult for Russia. Then, in terms of an invasion for Russia, they want to have air supremacy where they can have fighter aircraft, bomber aircraft operating over Ukrainian forces at all times, being able to bomb them, to do reconnaissance, all those kind of things. And they clearly can't do that effectively right now. I think part of that is because Ukraine's air defenses are still intact, and part of that is because the Ukrainian Air Force is still operating and still contesting the environment. So all of that makes it more difficult for the Russian Air Force. And a really key part of this is that interdiction missions, the really key mission that the Russian Air Force would like to take part in, that would include preventing the Ukrainians from reinforcing locations, from resupplying cities, all those kind of things. And it's clear they're not really able to do that very effectively. And again, this is probably likely part of this is because the Ukrainian Air Force is still operating and still making the environment contested and making life difficult for the Russian Air Force, which is still part of the reason why Ukraine is resisting still today and why they're still having success.
Rob, thank you for your analysis. We appreciate it. Rob Lee, as a former Marine Corps infantry officer, we appreciate your time tonight.